It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
The morning before the Sterling Foundation Gala, the air in the Vance Conservatory tasted of cloying lilies and expensive desperation. It was a room designed to showcase life, yet every bloom felt curated and suffocating, much like the woman standing at its center. Lydia Sterling Vance moved with the predatory grace of someone who had never known the weight of a consequence, her silk robe hissing against the checkered marble floors as she inspected a tray of vintage emeralds. Elena Miller stood by the glass doors, her hands steady as she watched her adoptive mother. The forensic title report from Marcus Thorne was a heavy, invisible weight in her mind, a weapon she had spent weeks honing. She didn't need to shout to feel powerful, she simply needed to wait. "You're hovering, Elena," Lydia said without looking up, her voice as sharp as the diamonds she was currently discarding. "It's a trait you inherited from your biological mother, I'm afraid. That nervous, bird-like energy. It's why she could never hold on to anything. Not money, not land, and certainly not a daughter." The insult was calculated, a familiar barb meant to remind Elena of her supposed place in the hierarchy. Elena felt the familiar heat of a rage spike, but she didn't let it reach her eyes. Instead, she focused on the sensory anchor of the room, the sharp, metallic scent of the jewelry cleaner, and the distant, rhythmic snip of the gardener's shears outside. "I was actually thinking about the house," Elena replied, her voice a calm, low hum that seemed to vibrate in the still air. "It's a beautiful estate, Lydia. It's a shame the foundations are so much softer than they appear." Lydia finally turned, a mocking smile playing on her lips. "Foundations can be reinforced, dear. That's what the Sterling name is for. We provide the structure that people like you simply lack. Tomorrow night, when the governor is standing in this very room, no one is going to be looking at the dirt beneath the floorboards. They'll be looking at the legacy I've built." The arrival of Julian Vance broke the tension, though not for the better. He stumbled into the conservatory, his tuxedo jacket from the night before rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like a man drowning in a sea of his own making, a stark contrast to the polished perfection Lydia demanded. "I need another bridge loan, Mother," Julian muttered, ignoring Elena entirely. "The Atlantic deal is just. It's a bit delayed." Lydia sighed, a sound of theatrical disappointment, but she reached into a lacquered desk and pulled out a checkbook. "You're a Vance, Julian. Act like it. We don't beg, we command." She scribbled a figure that would have paid for Elena's archival degree 10 times over and tossed it toward him. Then she turned her gaze back to Elena, her eyes narrowing. "See, this is how the world works. Resources flow to those with the right names. Speaking of which, I've picked out your attire for tomorrow." She gestured to a garment bag hanging near the door. Elena unzipped it to find a dress of drab, institutional gray, the fabric a scratchy, cheap polyester that felt like an insult against the skin. It was a servant's color, intentionally chosen to ensure Elena faded into the background while Lydia and Julian shone in their silks and velvets. "It's modest," Lydia sneered, fingering the rough collar of the dress. "It suits a girl who spends her days in dusty basements. I wouldn't want you to feel out of place among the real guests." In the corner of the room, Silas Sterling sat in a high-backed leather chair, his gout-swollen leg propped up on an ottoman. He had been silent the entire time, but as Lydia delivered the final insult, his eyes met Elena's. He saw the way she didn't flinch. He saw the way her hand drifted to her pocket, where the flash drive containing Marcus Thorne's findings sat like a live wire. Silas let out a dry, rattling cough that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. "The girl has more spine than both of you put together," Silas rasped, his voice like gravel. Lydia rolled her eyes. "Don't start, Silas. The medication is making you sentimental. Elena knows her place. She's grateful for the roof over her head, aren't you, dear?" Elena stepped forward, her shadow stretching long across the marble. She looked Lydia directly in the eye, a move that usually earned her a week of cold silence. "I am very aware of what I owe this family, Lydia, and I'm even more aware of what this family owes me." Lydia's laugh was a sharp, brittle thing. "Owes you? We gave you a name, we gave you a life." You gave me a version of the truth, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. But truths have a way of shifting when you look at them under the right light. Enjoy the gala, Lydia. Truly, wear the emeralds. Drink the best champagne. Because tomorrow night, the world is going to see exactly what the Vance legacy is worth. To the very last penny. Lydia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before her arrogance reasserted itself. You're becoming dramatic, Elena. It's tiresome. Go and make sure the seating charts are finalized, and try not to get dust on that dress. It's the only one you're getting. Elena turned and walked out of the conservatory, her heels clicking a steady, deliberate rhythm on the stone. She didn't look back at the opulence or the insults. She reached into her pocket and felt the cool, hard plastic of the drive. 24 hours. The countdown had begun, and as she stepped into the cool hallway, Elena Miller didn't feel like an orphan or a charity case. She felt like the owner of every single brick in the building. She climbed the stairs to her small room, her mind already moving past the insults and toward the execution. The warning had been given, and as she expected, it had been ignored. That was the beauty of arrogance. It made the fall so much more spectacular. She sat at her desk, looking out over the manicured lawn that would soon no longer belong to the woman who claimed it. One more day. One more night of playing the Quiet Archivist before the lion finally opened its mouth. The next morning, the dining hall was filled with the sharp, acidic scent of expensive espresso and the rhythmic, clinical clinking of silver against bone china. Elena Miller stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the family she had served for years. Lydia Sterling Vance sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her silk robe shimmering like oil on water in the morning light. She didn't look up, but her lip curled in a familiar, instinctive sneer, as she sensed a presence that didn't belong in her pristine world. The archives are a disgrace, Elena, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet air like a blade. She finally looked up, her eyes scanning the younger woman's modest cotton blouse with visible distaste. I expect the Vance family history to be perfectly catalogued before the Foundation Gala tomorrow evening. If you can't handle the dust, perhaps you should find a job more suited to your limited pedigree. Julian Vance laughed, the sound wet and arrogant. He was slumped in his chair, nursing a hangover and a glass of orange juice that likely held more vodka than fruit. Leave her alone, Mother. She's probably just slow. Some people aren't built for intellectual labor. They're built for carrying things. Elena felt the familiar heat of indignation rise in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. Instead, she touched the small, hard rectangle of the USB drive tucked into the waistband of her slacks. It was a cold, metallic comfort against her skin. I'll ensure everything is exactly where it belongs, Lydia, she replied, her voice steady and devoid of the tremor they expected. You'll call me ma'am, Lydia snapped, slamming her spoon down. The sound echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. And you'll stay out of the way when the caterers arrive. I won't have you ruining the aesthetic of the evening with that drab presence of yours. Silas, tell her. Silas Sterling, sitting at the far end of the table, didn't look up from his newspaper. His hands trembled slightly, a detail Elena hadn't noticed until she started looking for weaknesses. The girl does her work, he muttered, his voice gravelly and distant. Leave it be, Lydia. The girl is a guest in this house by my grace alone, Lydia hissed, leaning forward. She should be grateful I haven't tossed her back into the gutter where she started. One mistake tomorrow, Elena, and you'll find out exactly how cold the world is for someone with nothing. Elena turned and walked toward the library, the sound of Lydia's sharp, entitled voice fading into a dull hum. She needed to make one more call. Once inside the sanctuary of the oak-paneled room, surrounded by the smell of old paper and beeswax, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized weeks ago. Marcus Thorne, a deep voice answered on the second ring. It's Elena. Do you have the verification? There was a pause, the sound of heavy paper rustling over the line. I've gone through the county records and the original Vance estate filings, Elena. The deed isn't just clouded. It's a blatant forgery. The land transfer from your biological parents to the Sterling Trust was never finalized. Legally, the ground this house sits on belongs to the Miller estate. To you, every square inch. Elena closed her eyes, a shiver of pure, cold adrenaline racing down her spine. And the injunction for the gala. It's ready, Marcus said. I'll be there at 8 tomorrow night, with the sheriff and the original filings. Thank you, Marcus. She hung up and leaned against the heavy desk. The weight of the secret felt like a crown. Later that afternoon, Julian cornered her in the narrow hallway leading to the servants' stairs. He smelled of stale cigarettes and unearned confidence. He leaned against the wall, blocking her path, his eyes darting around to ensure they were alone. I need 10 grand, he whispered, his voice low and desperate. I know you've been handling the estate's petty cash for the archives. Give it to me, and I won't tell Mother about your little attitude this morning. Elena looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing the rot behind the designer labels. I don't have your money, Julian, and I'm not your bank. He reached out, grabbing her arm with a bruising grip. Don't lie to me, you little orphan. You're nothing but a parasite feeding off our table. You're lucky we even let you breathe the same air. Elena didn't flinch. She leaned in, her voice a low, dangerous silk that made him blink. You should be very careful who you call a parasite, Julian. Especially when you're standing in a house you don't actually own. He scoffed, dropping his hand as if burned by her sudden intensity. Whatever, just stay out of my way tomorrow. It's a big night for people who actually matter. Elena watched him walk away, his gait unsteady. She went to the window, looking out at the sprawling, manicured gardens that would soon be hers. 20 hours. The countdown was no longer a weight, it was a weapon. Tomorrow, the parasite would reclaim the hive, and the Sterling legacy would finally face the true cost of its gratitude. 2 days later, Elena Miller sat in a glass-walled office that smelled of ozone and expensive espresso. The room was a sanctuary of cold, hard data, perched 30 floors above the city's frantic pulse. Across the polished mahogany desk, Marcus Thorne adjusted his spectacles, his movements as precise as the forensic algorithms he ran for a living. He was a man of facts, not feelings, which made him the perfect architect for the demolition Elena had in mind. It isn't just a clerical oversight, Elena, Marcus said, his voice a dry rasp as he slid a thick manila folder across the desk. It's a masterpiece of white-collar erasure. The original deed for the Sterling Vance acreage was never legally transferred to the Sterling Trust. The signature on the 1994 merger documents. It's a masterful imitation, but the ink composition is modern. It was backdated at least a decade after the supposed signing. Elena felt a rhythmic thrumming in her chest, a cold, steady beat of anticipation. She reached out, her fingertips grazing the rough texture of the paper. This was the weapon. The Sterling fortune, the sprawling gardens she had looked out upon 2 nights ago, the very foundation of Julian's arrogance, it was all built on a legal fiction. Can you prove the lineage? She asked, her voice barely a whisper but sharp as a blade. Marcus leaned back, a thin, clinical smile touching his lips. I've already done it. I traced the Vance bloodline through 3 separate archives. You aren't just an adopted charity case, as they've labeled you. You are the sole surviving biological heir of the original Vance estate. According to the law of succession and the clouded nature of that deed, the Sterlings haven't owned a single square inch of that property for 20 years. You do. Elena closed her eyes for a brief second, savoring the weight of the revelation. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the decades of being told she was lucky to breathe their air. She tucked the folder into her bag, the secret power of it radiating against her hip like a loaded gun. That evening, the Sterling Social Club was a sea of velvet, crystal, and the hushed, performative murmurs of the city's elite. Elena stood near the periphery of the ballroom, her modest navy dress a quiet shadow among the shimmering silks and designer labels. She watched the waitresses move with practiced grace, the scent of expensive lilies and aged scotch heavy in the air. Julian Vance was at the center of a laughing circle near the grand fireplace, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid held loosely in his hand. He looked every bit the crown prince, his tailored suit screaming of a status he hadn't earned. When his gaze landed on Elena, his expression curdled into a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Look what the cat dragged in," Julian announced, his voice carrying over the soft strains of the string quartet. The circle of socialites turned, their gazes sweeping over Elena with the cold, collective judgment of the wealthy. Claire Vance stood at his side, her diamond necklace catching the light as she tilted her head in a gesture of mock pity. "Elena, darling," Claire said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I thought we agreed you'd stay in the archives tonight. This isn't exactly a venue for the help." A few of Julian's associates chuckled. One man, a developer with a gold Rolex and a sneer to match, looked Elena up and down. "Is this the ward you mentioned, Julian? The one who's been living off your family's generosity?" Julian stepped forward, the smell of expensive cologne and entitlement radiating from him. He reached out, flicking a stray thread on Elena's sleeve with a dismissive, insulting gesture. "Generosity is one word for it. Burden is another. You're embarrassing the name, Elena. Go back to the house before I have the manager show you the service entrance. You don't belong in a room like this." The humiliation was sharp, intended to sting in front of the witnesses who now watched with amused detachment. But Elena didn't flinch. She felt the cool condensation on the water glass in her hand, her pulse as steady as a clock. She looked Julian directly in the eye, her silence stretching until the smirk on his face faltered just a fraction. "I'm leaving, Julian," she said, her voice low and perfectly calm, cutting through the ambient noise of the club. "But you should really enjoy that drink. Savor every drop. It's the most expensive thing you'll be tasting for a very long time." Julian let out a bark of laughter, though his eyes narrowed with a flicker of confusion. "Threats? From you? You don't have a penny that we didn't put in your hand. You're nothing without the Sterling legacy." "We'll see," Elena replied. She turned her gaze to Silas Sterling, who was watching the exchange from a leather armchair a few feet away. The old man's face was a mask of stoicism, but his fingers gripped the silver head of his cane until his knuckles turned white. He knew. He had to know the storm that was coming. As Elena walked toward the exit, the sound of Julian's renewed, hollow laughter followed her. He thought he was winning because he held the floor. He didn't realize the floor was already being pulled out from under his feet. Outside, the air was crisp and smelled of rain. Elena pulled her coat tight, her heart beating with a rhythmic, cold precision. 24 hours until the annual Sterling Gala. 24 hours until the parasite revealed who truly owned the hive. She pulled out her phone and sent a one-word text to Marcus Thorne. Finalize. The following morning, the Sterling estate was a hive of frantic, expensive activity. Elena walked through the foyer, where the scent of heavy lilies cloyingly masked the sharp tang of floor wax. From the study, she could hear the rhythmic, uneven thud of Silas Sterling's cane against the hardwood, a restless, paranoid sound that echoed through the hall. She didn't look like a woman who had been threatened with a life of poverty just 12 hours earlier. She moved with a rhythmic, cold precision that drew the wary eyes of the catering staff. "Still here, Elena." Julian Vance stood at the top of the grand staircase, adjusting his cufflinks with the casual arrogance of a man who owned the air everyone else breathed. He looked down at her, his expression a mixture of boredom and simmering malice. He hadn't changed out of his silk robe yet, the deep burgundy fabric a stark contrast to the utilitarian gray of her coat. "I have things to settle before the gala," she replied, her voice steady. She didn't look up at him, focusing instead on the heavy brass handle of the library door. "Settle, there's nothing left to settle." Julian descended the stairs, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. He stopped 3 steps above her, maintaining his height advantage. "I've already spoken to the lawyers. Your access to the trust is being frozen as of Monday. I'd suggest you start packing those little archives of yours. Maybe you can find a nice, dusty basement in the city to rot in." Elena finally met his gaze. She didn't flinch. Instead, she offered a small, thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're very confident for a man who hasn't checked his own ledger in weeks, Julian." He let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "My ledger. The Sterling name is the ledger. You're just a footnote we're finally erasing." He leaned in closer, the smell of expensive brandy and morning tobacco clinging to his breath. "Don't bother showing up tomorrow night. It'll be embarrassing when security has to escort a Miller out of a Sterling event." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," she said softly. She left him standing there, his arrogance acting as a blindfold. 10 minutes later, she was 3 miles away, sliding into the passenger seat of a nondescript black sedan. Marcus Thorne was waiting, the glow of a tablet illuminating the sharp lines of his face. He handed Elena a single, heavy vellum envelope. "It's all there," Marcus said. His voice was low, professional. "The original deed, the transfer records, and the forensic audit of the 1994 acquisition. Silas didn't just hide the truth. He buried it under 3 layers of shell companies. But he forgot one signature, one tiny, overlooked authorization from your biological father." Elena ran her thumb over the embossed seal on the envelope. The texture was slightly rough, the weight of it feeling like a whetted blade in her hands. "And the board? They've received the preliminary briefing," Marcus replied. "They think it's a routine compliance update for the gala. They have no idea they're about to witness an execution." "Good. Make sure the digital backup is live." By late afternoon, Elena stood at the back of the Metropolitan Hotel ballroom, the venue for the gala. The space was a cavern of gold leaf and crystal, with workers on tall ladders hanging silk banners that bore the Sterling crest. Elena watched as Claire Vance directed the placement of the head table with the frantic energy of a general preparing for a triumph. Claire looked up, her eyes narrowing as she spotted Elena near the service entrance. Claire marched over, the clicking of her designer heels on the marble floor sounding like a metronome for her irritation. "What are you doing here? This is a private walkthrough for family and essential staff." "Just checking the acoustics," Elena said, her eyes scanning the room. Claire sneered, her gaze raking over Elena's simple attire with visible disgust. "You don't belong in this room, and you certainly don't belong at that table. Julian told me about your little threats. It's pathetic, really, trying to bite the hand that fed you for 20 years. The hand didn't feed me, Claire. It just held the leash while it consumed my inheritance." Elena stepped forward, forcing the older woman to take a half-step back. "Enjoy the view from the stage tomorrow. It's the last time you'll be sitting that high." Claire's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "You ungrateful little—" "Careful," Elena interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "The staff is watching. You wouldn't want to cause a scene before the main event, would you?" As Elena walked away, she felt the weight of the room shifting. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the architect of a collapse. Back at her small apartment that night, she laid the documents out on her kitchen table. The countdown was over. Tomorrow, the Sterling legacy wouldn't just crumble, it would be reclaimed by its rightful owner. She picked up her phone and sent the final calendar invite to the entire board of directors. Subject: the truth of the Sterling acquisition. She closed her eyes, the silence of the room amplified by the storm beginning to rattle the window panes. 24 hours. One night left before the world Julian Vance built on lies finally met the truth. The evening of the Sterling Thanksgiving Gala arrived with a biting chill that even the 3 roaring fireplaces in the manor couldn't quite dispel. Elena Miller pulled her modest wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out of the rideshare vehicle. The gravel of the long, winding driveway crunched beneath her heels, a rhythmic, sharp sound that felt like a countdown. Above her, the Sterling estate loomed like a fortress of white stone and arrogance, every window glowing with a warm, amber light that felt entirely unearned. She paused at the base of the grand staircase, her fingers brushing the cool, smooth silk of her clutch. Inside, the weight of a single encrypted flash drive felt heavier than a lead bar. She had spent years walking these halls as a ghost, a secondary character in the grand production of Lydia Sterling Vance's life. Tonight, the script was changing. The heavy mahogany doors swung open before she could reach for the brass knocker. A young steward, someone she didn't recognize, offered a stiff bow. As she stepped into the foyer, the scent of expensive tuberose perfume and roasting sage hit her like a physical wall. It was the smell of her childhood, but tonight it lacked its nostalgic warmth. It smelled like a trap. "You're late!" A sharp, melodic voice rang out from the mezzanine. Elena looked up to see Lydia Sterling Vance descending the stairs. She was draped in emerald silk that shimmered like oil on water, her throat adorned with a collar of diamonds that caught the light with every practiced movement. She looked every bit the matriarch of a dynasty, her face a mask of porcelain perfection that betrayed nothing of the rot beneath. "The traffic was difficult," Elena replied, her voice steady and devoid of the tremor that used to define her interactions with this woman. Lydia reached the bottom step, her eyes raking over Elena's simple navy dress with a look of profound pity. "Clearly, though I suppose one can't expect punctuality from someone who relies on public transit and hired cars. I've had the staff set a place for you at the far end of the table, near the kitchen doors. It's best you stay out of the way once the board members start discussing the merger. Your presence is sentimental at best." Elena didn't flinch. She simply watched as her mother, the woman who had traded Elena's birthright for a seat at this table, adjusted a diamond cuff. "I appreciate the seat, Lydia. I wouldn't want to miss a single word of tonight's conversation." Lydia let out a soft, tittering laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't get ahead of yourself. You're only here because Sila's insisted. He's developed a strange, late-life soft spot for lost causes." She leaned in closer, the cloying scent of her perfume suddenly suffocating. "Try not to embarrass me. The board is already on edge after that ridiculous email you sent. Julian thinks it's a prank, but I know it's just a cry for attention. Behave, and maybe I'll see about increasing your monthly allowance." "I'm not looking for an allowance," Elena said softly. "Of course not," Lydia sneered, turning her back. "You're looking for a miracle. Unfortunately for you, the Sterling's on the heavens too." Elena watched her sweep toward the dining hall. The first rage spike hit her then, a hot, pulsing rhythm in her temples. It wasn't just the insult. It was the casual, effortless way Lydia dismissed the truth. She followed at a distance, entering the grand dining room where the air was thick with the low hum of powerful men and women. The board members were already seated. Julian Vance sat near the head of the table, his face flushed from the third glass of vintage scotch he was currently nursing. He looked older, the stress of his mounting gambling debts visible in the frantic way his eyes darted toward the door every time it opened. Beside him sat Claire Vance, looking bored and beautiful, her fingers tracing the rim of a crystal goblet. At the very head of the table sat Silas Sterling. He looked frail, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the white linen cloth, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. When Elena caught his gaze, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. It was the signal they had discussed. The evidence was verified. The trap was set. Elena took her seat at the very edge of the long table. From here, she could see the entire room. She was the outsider, the archivist they all assumed was there to take notes on a history they had already rewritten. "Now that we are all gathered," Lydia said, standing at the head of the table and raising her glass. The room went silent. Even the clinking of silver against china ceased. "I want to toast to the future. Tomorrow, the Sterling land acquisition will be finalized, securing our legacy for the next 100 years. We have faced challenges, and we have faced distractions." She cast a pointed, dismissive look toward Elena. "But the blood of the Sterlings always prevails." "Hear, hear," Julian barked, his voice a little too loud, a little too desperate. "To the legacy," the board echoed in a low, rhythmic drone. Elena felt the flash drive in her lap. She felt the vibration of her phone in her clutch. A text from Marcus Thorne. "The forensic title report is live on the secure server." The board members all just received the notification on their tablets. 321. Across the table, the CFO's iPad chimed. Then Julian's phone buzzed on the table. One by one, the digital heartbeat of the room began to accelerate. The board members, who had been smiling and sipping wine seconds ago, were now frowning at their screens. Lydia noticed the shift immediately. Her smile faltered, her grip tightening on the stem of her wine glass until her knuckles turned the color of bone. "Is there a problem? Julian, what is that?" Julian didn't answer. He was staring at his phone, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Elena stood up slowly, the sound of her chair scraping against the marble floor echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence. She didn't look at the board. She looked directly at the woman in the emerald dress. "The toast is a bit premature, don't you think?" Elena asked, her voice ringing out with a clarity that made the board members look up from their devices. Lydia's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine venom flickering in her gaze. "Sit down, Elena. You're making a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Lydia," Elena said, stepping away from the shadows of the kitchen doors and walking toward the center of the room. "I'm just providing the opening act for the main event." She reached into her clutch and pulled out the remote for the room's integrated presentation system, a system Lydia had installed to brag about her quarterly earnings. With a single click, the massive high-definition screen hidden behind the velvet curtains at the far end of the room began to descend. "What are you doing?" Lydia hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Security! Someone get her out of here!" But the security guards at the door didn't move. They were looking at Silas, who had raised a single, shaking hand to stay them. The screen hummed to life, casting a cold, blue light over the Thanksgiving feast. The first image wasn't a graph or a chart. It was a scanned copy of a deed from 1954, bearing the original Sterling seal. And right next to it, in high-resolution detail, was the forensic analysis showing the forged signature of Elena's biological grandfather. "You said the blood of the Sterlings always prevails," Elena said, her voice echoing in the stunned silence of the hall. "Let's see if that's true when the world finds out you're standing on stolen ground." Lydia's glass shattered on the floor, red wine splashing across the white linen like a fresh wound. She opened her mouth to speak, but for the first time in her life, no sound came out. She looked at the screen, then at the board members who were already beginning to stand, their faces twisted in a mixture of shock and corporate self-preservation. Elena smiled, a cold, clinical expression that had taken years to perfect. "Don't stop the toast on my account, Mother." "I believe you were just getting to the part about loyalty." The silence in the grand hall was heavy, thick with the metallic scent of spilled Cabernet and the ozone hum of the projector. On the massive screen, the forged signature of Elena's grandfather looked like a jagged scar across the history of the Sterling estate. No one moved. No one breathed. The board members, men and women who had spent decades bowing to the Sterling name, now stared at the evidence with the horrified fascination of people watching a skyscraper collapse in slow motion. Lydia didn't scream. Not at first. Instead, her features underwent a disintegration so complete it felt visceral. The practiced porcelain mask of the Sterling Matriarch, a face maintained by 30 years of expensive procedures and even more expensive lies, curdled into something unrecognizable. Her eyes, usually sharp enough to command a room, became glassy and unfocused, darting frantically from the high-resolution forgery to the stony faces of her peers. The regal pallor of her cheeks vanished, replaced by a splotchy, frantic heat that climbed from her throat to her hairline like a spreading rash. Her mouth hung open, her lower lip caught in a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that betrayed her guilt before she could even find her voice. The chin she always held high dropped, her shoulders hunching forward as if the very air in the room had suddenly gained the weight of lead. She looked less like a socialite and more like a cornered animal, realizing the cage door had been welded shut from the outside. Julian Vance slumped into his chair, his face the color of wet ash. He reached for his water glass, but his hand shook so violently that the ice rattled against the crystal like a death knell. Silas Sterling, the oldest man in the room and the keeper of the family's dwindling honor, didn't move a muscle. He simply stared at the screen, his heavy, white brow furrowed as he finally recognized the rot that had been festering in his own house. Marcus Thorne stood near the back, his arms crossed over his chest, his professional gaze fixed on Lydia with the clinical detachment of a surgeon looking at a terminal tumor. Claire Vance let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hand flying to her throat as she looked at the mother she realized she had never truly known. "It's a fabrication," Lydia finally shrieked, the sound tearing through the stillness like a serrated blade. She lunged toward the projector, her designer heels skidding on the wine-soaked carpet. "Elena, you ungrateful, pathetic little girl, you've doctored these. You've always been jealous of this family's legacy because you were never really part of it." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. She stood by the podium, her hands resting lightly on the wood, her pulse steady. "The original documents are currently being held by the State Archives, Mother. Marcus Thorne has already verified the ink density and the paper age. The legacy you're so proud of, it's a crime scene." The board members began to move, but not toward Lydia. They moved away. Chairs scraped harshly against the marble floor as the people she had spent years cultivating as allies physically distanced themselves. Within seconds, a literal circle of isolation formed around her. The social gravity that had always pulled people toward her had suddenly reversed. Elena picked up her coat from the back of her chair. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket. The digital backup of every cent Lydia had funneled through the forged trust over the last 20 years. "You said I didn't belong in this room because I didn't have Sterling blood," Elena said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, cold and clear as mountain water. She paused, looking at the woman who had traded a daughter's love for a stolen empire. "You were right. I don't belong in a room full of thieves. Enjoy the cleanup. I've already called the police to report the fraud." Elena turned and walked toward the double doors. She didn't look back to see Lydia fall to her knees. She didn't need to. The sound of the heavy mahogany doors closing behind her was the only finality she required. The air outside was crisp, smelling of rain and freedom, and for the first time in her life, Elena Miller breathed it in without feeling like she owed anyone an apology. The heavy mahogany doors had barely clicked shut behind Elena Miller, but the air in the Sterling Great Hall remained frozen, thick with the ozone of a lightning strike. Inside, the silence didn't just break, it shattered into 1,000 jagged whispers. Lydia Sterling Vance remained on the floor, her silk gown pooling around her like a shroud of defeated ambition. Her face, usually a mask of porcelain perfection and icy disdain, had undergone a grotesque transformation. The blood had fled her skin, leaving behind a sallow, waxen gray that made her look 20 years older in an instant. Her eyes, once sharp enough to cut, were wide and unfocused, darting frantically as if searching for a lie large enough to swallow the truth she'd just been served. Her mouth hung slightly agape, her lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that she seemed powerless to stop. The arrogant tilt of her chin was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out expression of raw, naked terror. The skin around her eyes puckered, her pupils shrinking to pinpricks of dark panic, as she realized the social scaffolding she had spent decades building was collapsing into the dirt. "Mother!" Julian Vance took a step toward her, his face a pale imitation of her shock. He reached out a hand, but his fingers shook with the frantic energy of a man who saw his inheritance evaporating. He looked around the room, his gaze landing on the guests who had, only moments ago, been hanging on his every word. They were backing away. Claire Vance stood among the socialites, her champagne glass trembling. She didn't move to help. Instead, she took a deliberate step backward, her eyes fixed on the spilled red wine that stained the white marble near Lydia's hem. It looked like blood. The elite of the city, the people Lydia had courted and intimidated for years, were suddenly very interested in the architecture of the ceiling or the exits. The social death was instantaneous. "Don't just stand there," Lydia suddenly shrieked, the sound raw and ugly, stripped of its cultured veneer. She clawed at the floor, trying to find purchase. "She's lying. Elena is a disturbed, ungrateful girl. Julian, call security. Have her arrested for slander. It isn't slander if it's documented, Lydia." The voice was low, gravelly, and carried the weight of a falling mountain. Silas Sterling stepped forward from the shadows of the gallery. The family patriarch looked smaller than he had a year ago, but his eyes were clear and devastatingly cold. He held a leather-bound ledger in his hand, the companion to the digital files Elena had carried out. "Grandfather, you can't believe her," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking. "She's trying to destroy us." Silas didn't even look at him. He looked down at the woman on the floor. I gave you the keys to this kingdom because I thought you had the strength to protect the legacy. I didn't realize you deturned the foundation into a graveyard. He looked toward the entrance. Come in, Marcus. Marcus Thorne entered the hall, his trench coat still damp from the evening mist. He didn't look like a lawyer, he looked like a reaper. Behind him, 2 men in dark suits followed, one carrying a briefcase, the other wearing the unmistakable windbreaker of the Financial Crimes Division. The room went silent again, the kind of silence that precedes a prison sentence. The accounts are frozen, Lydia, Marcus said, his voice devoid of emotion. He tapped a folder against his palm. The forensic audit Elena requested was completed an hour ago. We found the offshore shells. We found the forged signatures on the trust amendments. And we found the trail of the Sterling land sales you used to cover Julian's gambling debts. Lydia's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound. She looked at Julian, who suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. The betrayal was a two-way street. He had taken the money, but he wouldn't share the blame. You can't do this, she whispered, her voice failing. I am a Sterling, this house, this name. You are a Vance by marriage and a thief by choice, Silas interrupted. He turned to the guests, his gaze a silent command for them to leave. They didn't need to be told twice. The rustle of silk and the click of heels on marble filled the room as the witnesses to her downfall fled the sinking ship. Within minutes, the hall was empty of everyone but the family, the investigators, and the ghosts of the lies Lydia had told. She tried to stand, her hands slipping on the polished floor. No one offered a hand. She looked like a ghost herself, haunting a life that no longer belonged to her. Where is she? Lydia hissed, her eyes snapping to Marcus. Where is that girl? Elena is exactly where she belongs, Marcus replied, checking his watch. She's with the district attorney's office, handing over the original deeds. By morning, the Sterling Trust will be placed under a court-ordered receivership. You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the estate. The finality of the words hit her like a physical blow. Lydia slumped back against the base of a marble pillar, the cold stone pressing against her spine. She looked up at the portraits of the ancestors lining the walls, the men and women whose names she had used as a shield. Now, they seemed to be looking down at her with the same contempt she had once reserved for the rest of the world. Silas turned his back on her, walking toward the library without a word. Julian, sensing the shift in the wind, began backing toward the side door, already calculating how much he could pack before the locks were changed. Lydia was left alone in the center of the vast, echoing hall. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic pulse of sirens growing louder as they turned into the long, winding drive of the Sterling estate. The blue and red lights began to dance against the high windows, flickering over the gold leaf and the crystal, turning the palace into a cage. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold marble, trying to hold onto something, anything, that was still hers. But there was nothing left but the silence and the approaching dark. 6 months had passed since the Sterling name had been stripped of its untouchable luster. Elena Miller stood in the sterile, white-walled corridor of the hospice center, the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a ventilator, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. She didn't miss the marble floors of the estate or the suffocating weight of the ancestors' portraits. Here, the air smelled of antiseptic and lemon-scented industrial cleaner, a sharp contrast to the expensive lilies that used to mask the rot in her family's home. Marcus Thorne stood a few paces behind her, a silent shadow of support. He had been the one to help her untangle the final legal knots, ensuring that the wealth Lydia Sterling Vance had spent decades stealing was finally diverted to the families who had originally owned the land. The heavy door at the end of the hall swung open, and the sound of frantic, uneven footsteps echoed against the linoleum. Elena didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The scent of stale cigarette smoke and cheap, drugstore perfume preceded the woman who had once been the queen of the city's social circuit. Lydia looked like a ghost of herself. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thin and brittle, pulled back into a messy knot. The designer silk dresses had been replaced by a pilled, navy wool coat that was missing a button. She stopped short when she saw Elena, her eyes darting toward the closed door of the private suite. "You have no right to be here," Lydia snapped, though the venom in her voice lacked its former bite. She clutched a cracked faux leather handbag against her chest as if it were a shield. "He's my father, not yours. You're just the help we forgot to fire." Elena turned slowly, her expression as cool as the glass of the observation window. "He asked for me, Lydia. He's been asking for weeks. You would have known that if you hadn't been so busy dodging process servers in that cramped apartment on 4th Street. Lydia's face flushed a blotchy, humiliated red. The face slap of her public downfall hadn't ended at the Sterling estate. It had followed her into every grocery store and bus stop. "I am a Sterling. This is a temporary setback. Once Sela's passes and the estate is settled, I'll have my lawyers." "There is no estate," Elena interrupted, her voice a calm, steady blade. "Sela's signed the final transfer of the trust yesterday. The house, the accounts, the investments, they've all been liquidated to pay the reparations for the title fraud. You aren't getting a cent. Even this room is being paid for by a private foundation I established." Lydia's mouth opened, then closed, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. She looked at the door, then back at Elena, the realization of her total isolation finally sinking in. You took everything, you left me with nothing." "I left you with exactly what you earned," Elena replied. A soft, sustained beep began to emanate from the room behind them. Elena turned back to the window. Inside, the monitor showed a flat, unwavering line. Sela's Sterling was gone, taking the last of the old guard with him. The nurses moved in with practiced, quiet efficiency. Lydia let out a strangled, pathetic sound, not of grief for a father, but of the finality of her own defeat. She slumped against the wall, the rough texture of the wallpaper catching on her cheap coat. She looked small, bitter, and entirely alone. The funeral 3 days later was a quiet affair, held under a gray, weeping sky. Julian Vance didn't show up. Rumors suggested he was somewhere in Macau, trying to outrun debts that no longer had a family fortune to cover them. Claire Vance had sent a brief, formal note from a clinic in Europe, opting for distance over closure. Elena stood at the edge of the grave as the casket was lowered. She felt the weight of the Sterling name finally lifting from her shoulders, though the cost was etched in the lines of exhaustion around her eyes. She had won, but the victory felt like a heavy, cold stone. She had lost the family she thought she had, replaced by the cold, hard truth of who they really were. As the small crowd dispersed, Elena walked toward the cemetery gates where Marcus was waiting. She pulled a set of heavy brass keys from her pocket, the keys to the Sterling estate's main gates. She didn't look back as she dropped them into the metal collection bin for the Historical Society. "Where to now?" Marcus asked softly. Elena looked out at the city, the rain washing the dust from the streets. For the first time in her life, she didn't have a file to archive or a lie to maintain. "Somewhere quiet," she said, her voice finally catching a hint of the morning light. "Somewhere where the name on the door actually belongs to me."
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.